Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar discussion on Ancient Rebellions, Lasting Echoes. I'm Elliott Drago, the resident historian and manager of network engagement at the Jack Miller Center, a nonpartisan educational venture committed to solving the crisis of uninformed citizenship by teaching America's founding principles and history. The Jack Miller Center has three central objectives: build and empower a movement of scholars who are focused on civic literacy, forge new models in university-based preparation of K-12 civics and history teachers, and grow the national coalition of civic education leaders, practitioners, and funders for a renaissance of civic awareness and purpose. You can learn more at the Jack Miller Center website, jackmillercenter.org. Today, we're here to converse and learn from the award-winning historian and Jack Miller Center Academic Council member Barry Strauss and talk about his book, Jews versus Rome, 2 Centuries of Rebellion Against the World's Mightiest Empire. Dr. Strauss is the Corliss Page Dean Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution of Stanford University, as well as the Bryce and Edith M. Baumar Professor in Humanistic Studies Emeritus at Cornell University, where he is the former chair of the Department of History as well as Professor of History and Classics. He is also the winner of the 2025 Bradley Prize, honoring his lifelong dedication to the study and teaching of Western civilization and classical and military history. Dr. Strauss's new book reveals the tenacity of the ancient Jews and shows how their revolts reshaped both the Roman Empire and Judaism. Across 2 centuries, pivotal Jewish revolts against the Roman Empire echoed with civil and religious conflict, not unlike the struggles of our own age. Though these uprisings ultimately failed, the Jewish people endured, offering timeless lessons in resistance and perseverance. Are you ready to begin, Barry?
I am indeed, Elliot.
Excellent. Thank you again for being here. So, my first question for you is, having written on many fascinating and important aspects of the ancient world, from Spartacus to the Caesars, what inspired you to write Jews versus Rome?
Well, thank you, first of all, for having me here, Elliot. It's a total pleasure to be here. And that is a great question. I would say that, uh, like many historians, I do pay attention to what's going on in the present day. And one of the things that struck me in the little that I knew about this subject was the Iranian connection. Of course, nowadays, unfortunately, the Islamic Republic of Iran is a deadly enemy of the State of Israel, wants to see it destroyed. And I was struck by the fact that in antiquity, it was just the opposite, that the ancient Iranian Empire at the time, the Parthian Empire, was a friend and ally of the Jewish people, the Jewish state, and at one point was almost certainly colluding with it in its revolt against Rome. So that made me think, gee, I'd like to follow this thread. I'd like to see what insights I could gain about this revolt by looking at that. So that got me into the subject. And as usual, when I start a book, I get into trouble and discover there's a lot more there than I thought there was. It's a very complicated subject, and many excellent scholars have written about it. So there was a lot to read, there was a lot of work to do, a lot of archaeological sites to visit, and the story got ever more complicated as I got deeper and deeper into it.
That's fascinating. So, let's stick with geopolitics for a moment here. So, caught between empires, what made the geopolitical realities of Judea so unique?
Well, if you look at a map of the Roman Empire, you will see that Judea is on the eastern fringe. But then if you expand the map and you look at the Middle East and you look at Southwest Asia, more generally in Northwest Africa, you'll see that Judea is actually in the center of things and not on the fringe. It's at the eastern edge of the Roman Empire, but it's just across the border from the western edge of the Parthian Empire. The Parthian Empire, the ancient Iranian Empire at the time, was the only imperial rival left standing against Rome. And Judea, like many small states, was caught between two empires and tried to play one against the other. It was in a unique position to do so because Judea might have been the center, the heart of the ancient Jewish population, but there were large diaspora communities, one stretching to the west and the north in the Roman Empire, and the other stretching to the east in the Parthian Empire, because there was a very large Jewish community in what is now southern Iraq, what the Jews at the time called Babylon, as well as elsewhere in the Parthian Empire, in northern Iraq, northern Mesopotamia, and also in Iran. And so, and the Jews of the Parthian Empire were closely connected with the Jews of Judea, and through them to the Jews of the Roman Empire. So this is an international group, and also unusual in the Roman Empire because, as I said, the Jewish diaspora spread throughout the Roman Empire. Probably the largest Jewish city in the world at the time was Alexandria, Egypt. Large Jewish populations in Syria and what is now Lebanon as well, also in what is now Turkey, Greece, and in the city of Rome itself. So um, the Jews had a unusual, if not unique, position in the Roman Empire because of their spread and their international spread.
Excellent. Thank you. So you write that Roman-Jewish relations worked until they didn't.
Yes.
What led to the unraveling of this relationship, and to what extent were Jews themselves united in their views about the Romans?
Yeah. So another great question. When I say that it worked, I guess I should say that it barely worked.
Hmm.
There were, from the time that the Romans conquered Judea in 63 BCE under Pompey, famous Pompey the Great, there was opposition within Judea to the Romans, and there both because people wanted their own independence, naturally enough, as any nation would. Also, for religious reasons, people felt that the Roman pagans desecrated the Holy Land. Also, for geopolitical reasons, there were those in Judea who would have preferred to have an alliance with Parthia, which was available. And Parthia did invade Judea and conquer it in the year 40 until the Romans drove them out 3 years later. Um, Still, when the Romans came back and they put their client king on the throne, the famous and infamous Herod the Great, Herod managed to square the circle. He managed both to be a loyal subject of Rome and to be a patriotic ruler of the Jews. On the one hand, he builds temples to Augustus around Judea. On the other hand, he rebuilds the temple to its greatest glory in ancient times, the famous Second Temple of, of Herod. And he was a tyrant, a bloody and brutal tyrant, but he managed to keep order and he managed to keep within the good graces of the Roman Empire, particularly the Emperor Augustus, with whom he had a close relationship. After his death in the year 4 BCE, things start to unravel. There are a series of rebellions, relatively minor rebellions because they are put down quickly by fast-acting Roman governors of Syria. Um, and within about 15 years of Herod's death, the Romans pull the plug and they make Judea a province. They take away its independence altogether. And there's always low-level resistance, low-level violence, a series of individuals who rise up, and each of whom is recognized as a Messiah, some of whom want to lead rebellions against Rome, others, and the most famous, of course, is Jesus Christ, who are not violent rebels, but who represent spiritual resistance against Rome. Still, somehow Rome is able to keep a lid on all of this until, under the reign of the Emperor Nero, the Romans get more aggressive in wanting to take money from the temple in Jerusalem and in punishing what they see as Jewish misbehavior, massacring civilians in Jerusalem, siding with one of the other ethnic groups in Judea, because Judea was a multi-ethnic state, siding with the Greeks. That's a term that's used for Greek speakers. Some of them were descendants of Greek or Macedonian colonists. Some of them were Syrians who had become Greek speakers, or some of them native Canaanites who lived there who had become Greek speakers. And all of this gave an opening to those Jews who had been plotting rebellion against the Romans. And so in 66, an out and out rebellion broke out. I should also say the Roman Empire under Nero was having hard times. It had suffered a significant defeat at the hands of its rival Parthia in the east in the year 63. There had been a rebellion against Nero in the year 65. Nero managed to put the rebellion down, but it was no secret that there was great discontent among the Roman aristocracy, the Roman nobility, about Nero. And a strategist in Judea might have thought this is a moment for rebellion, both because of Roman misbehavior and because of Roman weakness, and because maybe there's an opening for Parthian help. So all of those things took what had been a flammable situation, but one that was kept under control, and it set afire.
Excellent. Can you go into a little more detail, perhaps, about the scope and the grandeur of the Second Temple?
Yes, so the Second Temple, like its predecessors, stood on a hill above Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a city that's built on hills, like Rome, and the temple stood on the highest, the grandest of these hills within the city walls. Uh, there had been a first temple destroyed by the Neo-Babylonian Empire in the year 586 BCE, and then rebuilt. At the end of the 6th century BCE. But it was not rebuilt as a particularly splendid place. It was rebuilt by Jewish returnees who had been forced into exile in Babylon. They didn't have a lot of money, didn't have a lot of resources, and they built a fairly bare bones temple. And Herod, who was grandiose and a great builder, decided he was going to turn this into a really remarkable, splendid temple. So the first thing he does is he artificially increases the size of the hill that the temple is built on, and he builds large retaining walls to hold up this artificial mound. Some of those walls can still be seen today, including the famous Western Wall, formerly Wailing Wall, which is a site of Jewish pilgrimage to this day. But there are other parts of the wall that are also visible, and you can even take an underground tour of the walls and see just how huge the blocks were, massive blocks that Herod put there. Then on the top of this mound, he built a temple proper with a series of courtyards leading to it. Apparently, a spectacular building with marble, ivory, gold, silver, and then around it, a series of porticos, several football fields in size, a series of porticos that held meeting rooms, shops, places where pilgrims would come and rest, or where they would change money. And they would need money because pilgrims would want to make sacrifices at the temple. So there were daily sacrifices and then sacrifices by pilgrims, sacrifices by people who were just visiting the temple. And there were three great pilgrimage festivals during the year where there would be a lot going on. There were priests, there were Levites who sang psalms, and there was also a rather impressive pilgrim's road that led down from a part of the lower city where there was a natural spring and a pool, the famous pool of Siloam. Pilgrims would immerse themselves there, and then they would walk up, literally walk uphill to the temple. It would be quite an experience. And under Herod, Jerusalem reached its largest size and most impressive prosperity until the 20th century. So it was really quite something. And pilgrims came from all over the ancient world, mostly Jews, of course, but also non-Jews would come because this laid claim to being the most grandiose temple of the ancient world. It was really quite spectacular.
Wow, you really bring it to life. Thank you.
Welcome.
So many listeners know about the destruction of the Second Temple,
Right.
but may not be familiar with other revolts in the
Yeah.
region, like the Diaspora revolts or
Right.
the Bar Kokhba revolts. So,
Yeah.
what were some of the common threads between these revolts, and what was truly at stake for the Jews?
Well, I think first of all, national independence was at stake, and you know, I think when we're talking about this period of history, we can't really separate politics and religion. The same people who thought that Israel should be independent, they called it Israel, by the way. And in ancient times, in this period of antiquity, it was called Judea. Um, but the rebels referred to went back to an earlier name for it, and they called their state Israel. Um, they wanted it to be free, so they issued coins, and one of the slogans on the coins is "For the freedom of Zion."
Mm.
And they would also talk about the coins as being shekels of Israel. Another of their slogans was for the redemption. And so they thought that this was going to augur in an age of redemption. It's a great period of belief in apocalypticism, that the world as we know it is going to come to an end, and a new era of redemption is going to be brought in. Usually thought it would be ushered in by a descendant of the house of David, King David, who they referred to as the Anointed One or the Messiah. Um, so the rebels wanted all that. After the temple was destroyed, they wanted to rebuild the temple. They wanted to rebuild Jerusalem. And again, they wanted national independence. And they wanted to be free of the Romans. Some of them might thought realistically they could not survive as a small state. And so some of them might have said, we would prefer to be under the Parthians. We would prefer to be a client kingdom of the Parthians than to be a client kingdom of Rome. Um, but I think those are the common threads between the rebellions.
Thank you. Fascinating.
Yeah.
So another question that we have here is, so several women played prominent roles in the region's politics, including Berenice of Chalcis. I
Right.
pronounced that city correct, right?
Yeah, you did.
Correctly. So
Yeah.
as a member of the Herodian dynasty, Berenice may have enjoyed greater freedom than most women. So how did she manage to exert real influence in such a deeply patriarchal society?
Oh, well, it's a really good question. It is a patriarchal society, but it's one in which women also have a fair amount of influence behind the scenes. Um, and in the royal family, they have even more influence. To some extent, the Herodian dynasty is a Greco-Roman dynasty, um, and very much part of the elite of the Roman world. Uh, uh, Berenice or Berenike, you can say either name. She is, in a sense, the first lady. Her brother Agrippa II is the king of what is now Galilee and the Golan, northern Israel. After the death of Herod, the kingdom was split up into three parts. And although the central part around Jerusalem and the coast is a Roman province, the northern part of Galilee, Golan, a little bit of Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon is ruled by Agrippa the second. So, and Agrippa the second also has a lot of authority in Jerusalem, although the Romans are the ultimate authority there. So, Berenice goes to Jerusalem. She tries to persuade the rebels not to revolt against the Romans. She tries to persuade the Romans not to be violent in their suppression of the rebels, and she fails. And then she gains influence in a different way. She becomes the mistress of one of the leading Roman commanders. So the leading general that who Nero sends out to put down the revolt is a man named Vespasian. His son is named Titus, and Titus and Berenice become lovers.
Mm.
And Titus takes this affair very, very seriously. Ultimately, his father becomes emperor, and then Titus is his father's right-hand man back in Rome, and he brings Berenice with him back to Rome, and they're in love with each other. He wants her to become his spouse. Um, to become the de facto empress, but this is too much for the Roman Senate. They're not willing to have a foreign woman, not willing to have a Jewish woman who's a member of the nation that had rebelled so violently against Rome, and so they force him to send her away. But until that time, she had a lot of power. I mean, she's very intelligent. She's a very good speaker, and she knows how to use her influence. So, through these various ways, she's a real player.
Wow, amazing. So your book highlights several forms of Jewish resistance,
Right.
and one of my favorite parts is your use of this term spiritual resistance, right? So
Right.
what did spiritual resistance mean in this context, And what might this form of resistance reveal about the ancient world?
Well, I think that's a really good question, and there are different forms of spiritual resistance. One is the form associated with Jesus, when he says famously, "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar, and unto God the things that are our God." Exactly how that would have worked out is not clear, but we know that for Christians later on, there's a problem. They don't want to worship the emperor. And if the emperor insists upon them worshiping them, that can lead to punishment and martyrdom. Uh, for Jews, eventually the idea, after the revolts uh, fizzle out, they don't fizzle out, they're destroyed, they're defeated, they're crushed. There emerges the rabbinic movement, even after the first revolt, it starts. And the rabbis' attitude towards the Romans is essentially, we don't like them, but we have to accept them. We have to live with them. We have to defer to them, accept them, but we must never think that they are the ultimate, and we must not want to assimilate to become Romans, because there were Jews who assimilated and became Romans, particularly in the diaspora, and not only there. And the rabbi said, um, "We'll accept Rome. We have no choice, but we'll never believe that they are the ultimate. We'll always think that our higher loyalty is to God. Our higher loyalty is to the covenant between God and the Jewish people. And we know that the Roman Empire, for all its glory, is really nothing, and it will fade away, but the covenant will continue. So that's their belief, and they create a very impressive infrastructure to support this. Um, you know, grounded in two books. First, the Mishnah, which means something like repetition, revision, um, study, which is compiled around the year 200 in Galilee. And then over several centuries later, um, the Talmud, which means something like the study, the learning, which is a commentary on the Mishnah. And the two of them uh, try to codify what earlier had not been codified. That is, the customs, the practices, the so-called oral law of the Jews. And they try to create a foundation for Judaism to continue without the temple, for Jews to engage in daily prayers and in an annual cycle of festivals and prayers that would reiterate, repeat, um, recapture what had happened in the temple without the temple, while at the same time remembering the temple. And to remember is one of the basic injunctions of rabbinic Judaism, and hoping that someday in God's good time, he would rebuild the temple. It's an elite movement. It is, in some sense, a cranky movement, a fringe movement. It doesn't take hold overnight. It takes centuries for it to become the dominant movement in Judaism, but indeed, that's what happens.
Wow. Well, I want to ask about your sources because here at the Jack Miller Center, our scholars, when they're training teachers on how to evaluate primary sources, right? How to
Yeah,
look at them critically.
right.
And since ancient writers were often prone to exaggeration, not to say that modern writers aren't prone to
Yeah,
exaggeration, but especially when reporting statistics, and given your reliance on Josephus and the Jewish War, how did you go about assessing the reliability of the figures that he reports?
right. Well, everything you say is true. So I think what you have to do is you have to be an expert in ancient history, which I modestly would say that I am. And you have to know what's practical, what will work, and what's not practical, what won't work. So, some of Josephus's figures for, say, the population of Jerusalem, I believe he says it's over 1 million. We know that's just not possible given the size of the city, population density in the ancient world. And so we have to cut it down to size to a more reasonable figure. On the other hand, when Josephus says that 97,000 people, mostly Jews, were taken captive and enslaved after the end of the Great Revolt, we can say that is a plausible figure. We can't be sure it's true, but it's not crazy. And we also would think that the Romans might have kept statistics as to the number of people they enslaved. By comparison, when Julius Caesar says that when he conquered Gaul, he killed 1 million people and enslaved another 1 million people, I know Gaul's a much bigger place than Jerusalem, but you have to say that seems a little high. So that, there's a site where Josephus himself led the resistance against Rome. It's a small city in Galilee called Jotapata, um, and it's been excavated in Israel in the 1990s. And, given the size of the city, the excavators can tell us that when Josephus says that 40,000 people were killed there, that is almost certainly quite an exaggeration. I don't remember offhand the number the excavators have, but I believe it's less than 10,000. So still a significant number, but so that kind of thing. Sometimes we have different sources. Josephus is by far our biggest, our richest source, but we do have some other sources from the period. The historian Tacitus wrote a book about this era, and there's a long section about the Jewish War. Unfortunately, we only have the first part of it. We don't have the whole thing, but the first part is very useful, and there seem to be quotations to it from other later ancient writers. Archaeology is tremendously important in reconstructing this. So you have to be a bit of an archaeologist if you want to be an ancient historian. Coins, immensely important. Many people have said that the coins were the tweets of the ancient world. They were also the billboards. They were the political advertisements. We have a lot of coins, and they tell us a lot about the messages that various regimes wanted to give out. Um, and inscriptions, we sometimes have inscriptions that can be useful. So you have to put together a wide range of sources. And you have to know about a lot of different things. So for some of these revolts, the church fathers are very useful and very important. So you have to learn something about patristics and how you evaluate such sources. By the same token, the Mishnah and the Talmud are also of some value. And you have to know, well, can historians trust them? What is the degree of historicity of those sources? So you have to spread your net widely. I should also mention papyri.
Mm.
So the conditions in the Judean desert are very favorable for the survival of things from the ancient world. And we have a fair number of papyri, both from the Great Revolt and from the Bar Kokhba Revolt, that are extremely revealing about what went on. The diaspora revolt was centered in Libya, Egypt, and Cyprus, also Mesopotamia. And we have some papyri from Egypt, which are also very favorable for preserving papyri, that shed light on that revolt as well. So there's a lot of stuff. It's a juggling act, a very complicated material, and the historian has to sift and weave through material in order to put it together.
Excellent. So let's stick with the Bar Kokhba revolt for a
Yeah,
second.
yeah.
So do you believe that the independent state created by the Jews during the Bar Kokhba revolt was indicative of how they envisioned their society functioning if they succeeded in expelling the Romans? And in general, what made Bar Kokhba such a controversial figure?
Well, I mean, first of all, not everybody in Judea would have agreed that another revolt against the Romans was a great idea at this point,
Right,
given that two had failed.
right.
Secondly, it's clear that his messiahs considered him to be excuse me, his followers considered him to be the Messiah. And there would be two groups of people who'd be skeptical of this. First of all, Christians would be skeptical of this because they believed that Jesus was the Messiah and they wouldn't follow Bar Kokhba. And secondly, many other Jews would be skeptical of this. There's one famous rabbi, Rabbi Akiva, who seems to have accepted Bar Kokhba as a Messiah. And there is another rabbi whose name escapes me at the moment, but he replied to Rabbi Akiva, grass will be growing out of, um, uh, I think it's Bar Kokhba's skeleton, and still the Messiah will not have arisen. Perhaps he says, grass will be growing out of your skeleton, Rabbi Akiva. Forgive me, I don't remember precisely. But he's very skeptical about that as a Messiah. And Bar Kokhba's method of fighting was unlike the rebels in the Great Revolt. He was going to conduct irregular warfare, a guerrilla operation, and many of his bases, he had bases all over the central part of the country. They were underground,
Mm.
tunnels, caves, and some of them were in towns and villages where people lived. And not everybody in those towns and villages was down with the idea of having these rebels among them because they knew what the Romans would do in retaliation, which is to say, wipe out the towns and kill and enslave the people who live there. So not everybody would be in favor of this revolt, but nonetheless, many people were.
Wow. So today, and it was kind of in pop culture for a bit about, how often do you think about the Roman Empire? Many people, seem captivated by the grandeur of ancient Rome. And you've written how the Romans were a paradoxical people who
Right,
both brutalized their enemies and yet in some cases, like that of Trajan, created a welfare program for poor
right.
children in Italy.
Yeah.
So given the focus of your book, are there any aspects of Roman civilization that you find admirable?
Oh, certainly. I mean, clearly there are many aspects that I don't find admirable,
Okay.
but, we can't deny the fact that the Romans were great legalists and, they left the West this heritage of law codes. They were included some great literary figures. They were great speakers like Cicero, poets uh, like Virgil. They were great builders. First of all, they were engineers, and some of their roads still stand, and a few of their bridges still stand. None of their aqueducts stands completely, but we can see the ruins of them. They were great urban designers. You only have to go to Rome and um, see the ruins there and how impressive they are, and not just in Rome. And there is much for armies to learn from the discipline of the Roman army. Um, and there are still places where you can go and see that vividly. I mentioned Masada, but also in England, Hadrian's Wall and the towns, the military camps associated with Hadrian's Wall are quite remarkable. I would also say there's something to be learned with the Roman attitude towards what we now call diversity, and that is the Romans were highly inclusive. They were the first people in history we know of to create a mass citizenship. Greek
Mm.
city-states had citizenship, but it was always for a few, for a minority, really. The Romans extended it to all the free people of their world. Now, it is true that the more they extended the citizenship, the more they devalued it.
Huh.
And the great era of extending the citizenship is under a monarchy in which ordinary citizens had little say. But they still did extend the citizenship, and the citizens had certain privileges. For example, St. Paul, when he's put on trial in Judea, famously says, Civis Romanus sum, I'm a Roman citizen, and I'm entitled to a trial in Rome. And so he was to sent to Rome. The other thing about the Romans is they built something that lasts. The Roman Empire is around for centuries before it is defeated. And it lasts for almost 1,000 years more in the East as the Eastern Roman Empire. We also call it the Byzantine Empire. But I think there's something to learn from all of this. And there's also a cautionary tale, because in the end, the Roman Empire falls and falls first in the West. And I think it's important for us to ask, well, why did it fall and what can we learn? Particularly important for us as Americans because the founders of the United States and the men who wrote the Constitution looked back to Rome, mostly to the Roman Republic, as a model of what they wanted to build. But they also looked to the empire, less so, but in some ways and paradoxically. As you know, Jefferson famously says that he wants America to be an empire of liberty.
Mm.
And what does that mean? What is an empire of liberty? And there are others who skeptically say you can't have a republic spread over an empire. A large republic isn't possible. Madison says it is possible, but is it? Um, and that's still a question uh, for us today. So I think it would be a big mistake simply to throw away the Romans and say they're simply brutes. They weren't simply brutes. They're complicated, and they offered enough so that there were Jews who gladly became Roman and assimilated to being Roman, and that wouldn't have been possible if the Romans were Nazis. And I don't just mean because of the Nazi attitude towards the Jews, because the Nazis crushed other people as well, the Ukrainians, for instance. The Romans knew how to use not just the stick, but also the carrot, if you forgive a cliche. They knew how to make themselves desirable to people, and they knew how to meet people halfway. So there's a lot to learn from that as well.
Thank you. That was a very thoughtful answer.
Thank
In the same vein, looking at the ancient world, particularly the era of Jewish revolts against Rome,
you. Right.
are there aspects of life or belief from that time that you think we've lost to our detriment?
Well, whatever you want to say about the rebels, they were patriots and they were willing to put their lives on the line for what they believed in. Um, they they did not they wanted to govern themselves, frankly, and they wanted to be free. And I mean, I think their devotion to freedom is something that um, we need to think about and to remind ourselves of. It's a paradox to me that one of the most eloquent speeches in ancient Greek in defense of freedom is the speech that Josephus puts into the mouth of the leader of the rebels at Masada. Now, this leader is a very he's a questionable guy in many ways, not least because, he is uh, um, responsible for the murder, the killing of the women and children of Masada and the killing of all the people of Masada. They prefer to die rather than to surrender and be enslaved by the Romans and see their women and children tortured. Um, I don't think that we could look at this nowadays and say, oh, that's just great. But the Romans and the ancients had a different attitude towards suicide, and they respected people who preferred to kill themselves than to accept enslavement. And so there, I'm certainly not advocating mass murder or suicide, um, but um, there's something about a devotion to freedom that we
Right.
can learn from.
Right. So yeah, let's stick with Masada here.
Oh,
Both the Jews and the Romans understood the symbolic nature of Masada, and you
yes,
you write how the site was a quote station on an ancient version of an underground railroad.
yes.
So what symbols did Masada evoke, and what were some of the challenges faced by both the leaders of the besiegers and the besieged?
Okay. So for the Romans, Masada was a familiar place for them. It's a place of refuge for runaways. Um, I I compared it to something that existed in the New World in the early modern period, maroon communities,
Yep.
where runaway slaves would go and enjoy freedom far from the law that would enslave them. The rebels at Masada were not slaves, although some of them might have been slaves, but probably most of them were free people who wanted to escape the Romans. Compared it to the Underground Railroad because some of the people who went there didn't stay there. They went there and then they used it as a stopping ground to go somewhere else, often Egypt, where many of them went. Um, the people who ran Masada belonged to the most extreme of the rebel sects against the Romans, the Sicarii, the assassins, the daggermen. They turned on fellow Jews and they were extreme in their belief that um, the only master they recognized was God. They didn't recognize earthly authority. They certainly didn't recognize the Romans. The Romans couldn't tolerate these sort of places. They weren't necessarily in a rush to put them down, but they always did put them down. And the example that I would give is um, the end of the Spartacus rebellion. So Spartacus is not just a Hollywood invention. There really was a Spartacus. There really was a rebellion against the Romans between the years 73 and 71 BCE. About 10 years later, um, there's a Roman general who is heading south in Italy on his way to cross the Adriatic to fight a war, probably in what's now Bulgaria, ancient Thrace. And on the way, he stops to go into the mountains of southern Italy to uh, destroy a maroon community of the survivor, one group of survivors from the Spartacus rebellion. And the Romans just don't want these things there. It's bad for business. You don't want slaves to know there's a place they can escape to. So they just go in there and massacre the people or re-enslave some of them. And I think Masada, from the Roman point of view, is similarly a mopping up operation. It's one of three mopping up operations a few years after the Great Revolt. They just don't want any loose ends. And they want to make clear that they're not going to tolerate another rebellion. So um, the Romans aren't going to allow this. The besieged will, um, they realize that they're not going to be able to stop the Romans. Um, the Romans build a ramp up to the top of Masada. And it becomes clear that once that ramp is complete, that the rebels don't have a choice. Josephus doesn't tell us this, but almost certainly the siege began with the Romans giving the rebels a chance to surrender, because that's what the Romans always did, because um, they didn't really like carrying out sieges. It was a lot of work, not a lot of glory. Um, there was no guarantee that there'd be a whole lot of loot to get from these people at Masada. They would have preferred. I would be surprised if they didn't offer them a chance to surrender. And if they did, the rebels didn't take it. Um, I think the rebels too wanted to make a statement, and their statement was that they would prefer death to dishonor, we might say, death to enslavement, death to surrender. There is a medieval Jewish retelling of the story of Josephus and the story of Masada. So Josephus's book is written in Greek. He says that he has wrote an earlier version in his native language, and we don't know if that was Hebrew or Aramaic. Probably Aramaic, because he says he wants people, even in the East, to be able to read it, and the language of most of the Jews of the East was Aramaic. That version doesn't exist. Um,
Huh.
but the thing that was written in the Middle Ages was written in Hebrew. And in it, they tell a different version of the end of Masada. In that version, the men do kill the women and children to spare them from the Romans, but they don't kill themselves. They die fighting with their swords in their hands against the Romans, which is a slightly different outcome. Which is the real one? I don't know. Probably Josephus, but we're not really sure. Josephus didn't have to tell the story of Masada. He made an editorial decision to end his book this way. It's how his account of the revolt ends, and it's extremely powerful. And it says something about the rebels. Although Josephus criticizes the rebels all over his book, he ends with this image of them doing something that, from the Roman point of view, was horrible but noble at the
Right.
same time. And you get the sense that the rebels cannot be defeated. Um, One of the pieces of research that I did that really fascinated me from the book was tracing what happened to the leader of the revolt, the leader of the besiegers, excuse me, a Roman named Flavius Silva. And I'm not going to say it today. I'm going to leave it as a cliffhanger. You have to read the book. But uh, I was really struck by what I discovered as to what happened to him and how much this conquest of Masada actually really mattered to the Romans in ways that Josephus doesn't tell us.
Wow. Well, thank you for the teaser. I mean, I've read the book, so I know what happens, but I encourage everybody listening, obviously, to
Thank you.
to
Thanks for playing
figure
along.
to figure out. So ultimately, your book serves as an inspiring example of resilience. And
Thank
so,
you.
do you have a favorite Jewish figure from your work who you believe embodies the Jewish struggle for survival?
That's a great question. I mean, I like Bar Kokhba for all the problems that he raises, but there's Rabbi Akiva who followed Bar Kokhba and who ultimately is a martyr. He's killed by the Romans for his his actions in the revolt, but he's a very important figure in the growth of rabbinic Judaism. There's also Rabbi Judah the Prince, a generation or two later. Traditionally, he's born the day Rabbi Akiva is martyred. We don't know if that's true. But he is the man who compiles the Mishnah, this book that is the foundation of the Talmud and really the foundation of modern Judaism, which is very different in some ways from ancient Judaism. Many similarities, but also many differences. He ends his life in Galilee, and he compiles this book that is really the foundation for so much of what Judaism becomes in future years. And his behavior is, on the one hand, to defer to the Romans, even to be obsequious to the Romans, but on the other, to make it clear that he considered the Roman Empire to be dust and it would fade away, and it's nothing compared to the belief in the one God of Israel. So, very dignified spiritual resistance, while at the same time saying, we don't dare ever have physical violent resistance again. That is completely wrong.
Wow. Okay, so I have the $64,000 question here.
Yeah,
Um, in an era of rapid technological change,
right.
what can studying ancient history teach us about ourselves and about our world? Why does studying ancient history still matter?
Well, thank you. It's a great question for lots of reasons. One reason is answered. I don't have to answer it myself because Clausewitz, the great military theorist, answered it for me. And he said that the character of war changes, the details change, but the nature of war does not. And I think that's really true. The nature of war does not change. I think it's important to go back to antiquity where we have so much information about war. That's the main thing that historians wrote about in the ancient world. And to kind of go back to the beginning, look at the bare bones of the nature of war, because there's a great deal that we can learn from antiquity. Uh, the other is that these are the societies, Greece, Rome, and Israel, that gave us the notion of freedom and being a free people and what it means. And by Israel, I also include Christianity, both the Old and the New Testaments. Uh, they also, in Greece and Rome, give us the notion of citizenship and the notion of a constitutional republic, and of course, the notion of democracy. Now, obviously, the meaning of those terms have changed. The details of those terms have changed in many ways since ancient times. But again, I would quote Clausewitz, the nature does not change. The details change. There are also, to be honest, things about the ancient world that we don't want to emulate. These were slave societies. And of course, we don't want to have slavery. Um, uh, Likewise, these were not societies that had equality for women and equality for non-citizens. So there are things there we don't want to emulate as well. But I think we have to be really careful about where the world is going today. Um, and, you know, I wouldn't be the first person who said that in a way, there's a debate going on in the world today, and that is, do we want to be a world of nations, of nation states, or do we want to be one big global community? And do we want to be a world where individual citizens matter and have some say, which they can do at the local level? Or do we want to be a world in which a wise elite governs us and governs everything we do? And I think we can get some perspective on that by looking at the ancient world that had to uh, wrestle with some of these same questions. Again, in America today, and in an era of we live in a multi-ethnic society, um, and there are things that we can learn, we must learn from cultures outside of the West. For example, there is a lot that we can learn from China and from East Asian civilization. That's pretty obvious. My personal favorite is Sun Tzu, The Art of War, but it's pretty limited, and there are many, many other examples. But in doing so, I don't think it's wise. I don't think we want to throw out the legacy of the West because ultimately, I think that's who we're about, regardless of who we are, regardless of our race, our religion, our national origins. Um, that's what it's all about on a fundamental level. And so we have to go back to it and not throw it out.
Thank you. Thank you.
Welcome.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Um, I have one more question, then we have an audience question. So,
Sure.
given that you just finished a wonderful book,
Thank you.
what's your next project?
Well, I'm tempted to say I could tell you, but I'd have to kill you. Not really. I have a couple of ideas, and one has to do with leadership, and one has to do with military deception or the art of deception. We'll see. We'll see which one wins the day, and which one becomes a story.
Okay. I thought you might be willing to perhaps juxtapose Frontinus with Sun Tzu,
Oh, that's a great
the
topic.
stratagem.
Thank you. Yeah.
There you
Well,
go. Free book. Free
if
book.
I do if I do if I go the deception route, that should be part of it. Thank you for the suggestion. Yeah, I mean, Frontinus and Sun Tzu are two um, favorites of mine. Two great books.
Excellent. Okay. Well, we have a question here from the audience.
Yeah.
Has to deal with an evaluation of Josephus. So,
Mhm.
how would you evaluate the role of Josephus in both a Jewish and a Roman context?
He's great question. He's one complicated guy.
Right.
So, Josephus is a Jew from Jerusalem. He comes from a priestly family, and on his mother's side, he's descended from the kings. And early in his life, he's kind of a go-between the Jews and Rome. He's clearly part of the pro-Roman faction. And then the revolt begins, and he becomes a leader of the rebellion in Galilee, possibly the leader of the rebellion in Galilee. Fights nobly against the Romans, but his city is conquered. And then, under very louche circumstances, he changes his tune, goes over to the Romans, becomes the collaborator of collaborators, the Benedict Arnold of the uh, Great Revolt, and ends up spending the rest of his life in Rome as a pensioner of the emperors. But he devotes himself to writing books to justify the Jewish people in the eyes of the Greco-Roman world. And he says he's still a total believer in the God of Israel and the Jewish religion, but also a patriot. And he does go out on a limb in Rome in a society that's not friendly to Jews at the time, on quite the contrary. Um, and he he does take a risk in writing these defenses of the Jewish people. So um, he's not he's not an either or kind of person. You have to evaluate him in a complex sort of way. He's also a marvelous writer, a great storyteller.
Wow. Um, so I guess one final question I'd have for you is so all these decades of research, these award-winning books, um, what has your work as an academic taught you about America's founding principles and history?
Hmm. Well, it certainly taught me, to respect even more the American founders, both the risks they took in rebelling against Britain, the audacity they showed in going for a French alliance, and the vision they had in writing the Declaration and the Constitution. Also, the education they had. Um, which was rooted in the classics and the Bible. Um, I mean, the Declaration is a beautiful document, and so is the Constitution. There's something to learn from them about the power of words. And the republic that they founded um, was extremely flexible. Um, it went in directions that they might not have seen. Uh, but they created obviously a lasting legacy, and I think it's my all credit to the Jack Miller Center. I think we need to go back and study this legacy, and love it, learn from it. It's always there. Again, want to um, we don't want to leave out the negative side of American history. The Constitution allowed slavery. We know that. We know that the founders debated it, and there's some of them who were anti-slavery, and that the new republic abolished slavery right away in Massachusetts and some other states. But that a very ugly story then continued, and particularly in the South. So it's a complicated story. It's not an either or story, but it's one in which there's so much goodness and so much value to gain from uh, the origins that it's one that we need to constantly relearn and teach. So thank you to the Jack Miller Center for doing just that.
Well, thank you, Barry, for again taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us. Thank you for this wonderful book. I encourage everybody to go out and buy 10 copies.
Thank you.
I want to say thank you to our audience members and the JMC communications team, including our manager of communications, Anna Zematitis. What a terrific conversation. If you like this webinar and you want to learn more about how the JMC supports the teaching of America's founding principles and history, I encourage you to visit our website, jackmillercenter.org, and sign up for our email list. A special thanks to the donors of the Jack Miller Center who make these programs possible. Once again, Barry, it was a pleasure. It was a dream come true meeting such a respected and down-to-earth historian. And we really appreciate your time.
You're much too kind. Thank you, Elliott. The pleasure was mine.